Okay. So recording is in progress. And I'm just realizing I haven't asked anyone to take notes. Barb Greeno is not able to be with us tonight, apparently. So if anybody is able to take notes for this brief meeting, I would appreciate that. And I'm calling the meeting to order at 7:03. And also it's being recorded, so no worries if you don't. Meeting is called to order at 7:03 and present are board members Jesse Haas and Pat Haas, Chris Harlow, Dan Axtell, Barbara Taylor, Obi Lisai, Ruth Grandy, and members Mary Norton, Mary Norton Shabbatskoy, Alice Kajano, and Michelle Boslin. And there we are. So the meeting's called to order. Okay. Ruth, did I say your name? I did.
Yes, we can do something about it. Okay, Barb.
Okay, we may have our secretary trying to join us, so let me just.
Barb, she says she can't find the link to join the meeting.
I'm going to just resend the link to Barb. So I'm just going to pause us and mute myself for a minute. Talk among yourselves.
Too much for talking.
Never stopped you.
Any word from Tyler and Aaron?
Yeah, today's Aaron's birthday.
Ah.
So yeah, they're back and getting back into the swing of things. So no big news though.
Yeah.
I see Jesse's talking, but I don't hear anything.
Need to unmute.
All right.
There you are.
We're waiting for Barb Greeno to join us. And in the meantime, I will accept a motion to hear the treasurer's report. Okay, Pat has moved. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Oh, Obi has seconded. So Dan, would you like to give us your report?
Sure. Let's see. I don't know if you can see it.
Well, we can see that there is one.
I can see it.
Oh, there it is.
Can you read it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So normally I would hand this out and you could look at it, but it's I don't think there are any big surprises. Last year was an unusual year for the amount of donations we got, but this year was more normal. We made a lot more interest this year, but that's because interest rates are higher. The CDs are now paying over 4%, and we'll get about $1,600 again this year. So that's $1,600 in interest is pretty expectable in the near future. Yeah, sales of books are falling off, and right, the town sent us our $1,500 payment, semi-annual payment, a little early this year. So I think they're just probably going to send it in September, the rest from now on. So we ended up with $4,500 from the town in this fiscal year, but I think in future years it'll show up as $3,000 steadily again. So that's $1,500. That's just a quirk of accounting. We're spending money on conservation again since Alice is back. We spent no money on conservation at all while Alice was out of commission. But then we're catching up. You can see we've spent $1,200 in conservation, which not outrageous. Hospitality is up because the Sons of American Revolution won't go away.
I think they're done.
Okay, no more
I think we
Revolutionary
got
War
them all.
soldiers. Okay. Okay, and then
We're very happy to collaborate with the Sons of American Revolution. I just want to say that in our recorded session here. We don't want them to go away.
Oh, okay. Oh, right.
Yeah, right. Yes, people
You're
are
right,
going to hear
they-
this, Dan.
I didn't mean to,
Mm.
to be nasty. Okay, so we have $45,997.44, and that is an increase of $5,157.51 from last year. So normally nonprofits have about zero for the change in financial position, but we've been just bringing in a lot of money these last few years and not spending it. But we do have plans, so I'm not concerned about that. But we have a very comfortable amount of money.
Thank you, Dan. So anybody have any questions or corrections? So if all those in favor of accepting the treasurer's report as presented, please say aye. Okay, and the treasurer's report is accepted. Barb, do you have the secretary's report from last year for the annual?
Yes, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. October 19th, 2023, the Westminster Historical Society annual meeting was held at the fire station on Ghost Street. Jesse Haas brought the meeting to order at 7 p.m. and a short business meeting was held. Secretary's report was read by Barb Greeno. Obolusai made the motion to accept the report as read. Pat seconded the motion and the motion carried. Dan Extel presented a yearly report. Obi Lisa made the motion to accept the report and it was seconded by Pat Haas. The motion carried without discussion. New business. Jesse Haas, president, said that Richard Michaelman wanted to be off the trustees. Chris Harlow will serve out the remainder of Richard's trustee duties. The new slate of officers was presented by Pat Haas, and they are Fletcher Proctor, Barbara Taylor, Lonnie Lisi. Jesse Haas asked the secretary to cast one ballot for the new slate of officers. Jesse Haas concluded the meeting and introduced Barbara Greeno, who spoke about the differences in Westminster between the 40s and the 50s and now 2023. Several paintings were on display for sale for $100. If anyone bought anything, the money would go to the Historical Society. There were no sales. Mary Shabaskoy of Westminster West did a great job of showing the paintings on her screen. Thank you so much, Mary. Linda Fawcett also gave a brief history of the Institute and the library. Dan Extel recorded the whole entertainment part, and Obi Lisi has put some pictures on the WHS Facebook to enjoy. Thank you, everyone, for making the evening a success. The evening came to an end at 8:15. Respectfully submitted, Barb Greeno, Secretary.
Thank you, Barb. So what's your pleasure? I entertain a motion to accept the secretary's report.
I'll make that motion to accept.
Obi makes a motion. Do we have a second? Okay, Pat got in first, so Obi moves, Pat seconds. And is there any discussion? I probably should have done that first.
It's Alice.
Alice, yeah.
I would like to remind everyone that this is a membership meeting and all of the members are allowed to vote.
Right, so unmute yourselves. Thank you, Alice. That means you. If there's no discussion, all those in favor of accepting the secretary's report as read, please say aye.
All right.
I,
Aye.
Okay, it passes. Thank you, Barb. So I have a brief president's report, which is informal and not something we need to pass or not pass. So it has been a busy year for us, and I'll touch on the highlights. And I also want to say it astonishes me that it's only a year ago that Chris came on the board. We've got about 5 years worth of work out of him so far. I think we made a good choice there. So work is ongoing at the archive, formalizing and cataloging our acquisitions. We put in new shelving to hold our supplies, and we acquired a wonderful set of flat file drawers free from Middlebury College, and now have a place to properly store maps and newspapers and other large paper items that should lie flat. Dan has given us now the ability to join or renew memberships on our website, westminstervthistory.org. So some of us have tried that out and it works. And so we have joined the 20th century.
21st.
Progress was made on the hearse house next to the church in Westminster West. I can't remember if it was last year that the town decided we applied for an ARPA grant and the town accepted it to the tune of $20,000. Money that needs to be obligated by the end of the year. And it was put out to bid, and Tim Lillis from Bellows Falls was the person who bid on it. And he is going to, his bid was high for the amount that we had, but he will do it in stages, and feels he can stabilize it with the amount of the ARPA grant. The select board then contemplates going before the town for
Please don't cry.
for the rest of what we might need. It might be about $15,000, and so we may consider fundraising or seeking a grant to help out with that. And the plan is to use it to store one of our hearses, which was made just downhill from the Westminster West Church in the 1870s in a mill down there. The 5th grade visited our museum in May for the first time since COVID. And teacher Emily Lisi had them very well prepared. So including, we had a 5th grader who had just a perfect grasp of what the Continental Congress was, which I really thought was impressive in 5th grade. I struggle with the Continental Congress myself. So Michelle Pagan, who is a high-level textile conservator who actually worked on the Star Spangled Banner restoration, learned about one of our very old samplers through the National Schoolgirl Sampler Project that we took part in last year. This was a sampler worked by Anne Ruggles in 1764, and she came to Westminster and became William Czar Bradley's mother-in-law. The sampler was interesting to Michelle. It's unusual because it has a tree on it. And she came and looked at our collection and took the sampler, that sampler, and a couple of pieces of lace and conserved and stabilized them. And she also looked at our embroidery patterns that were in the half trunk that belonged to Sally Bradley. And as far as we can understand, those were copied or traced by hand in an ink that was probably made from walnut shells or bark. And then sheer white material would have been laid over them, and the pattern pricked through with a needle into the cloth. And then it was stitched and it was stitched with white thread on white sheer material. And it astonishing to me that then fashionable women just made and wore just yards of this, and much of it on their underwear where nobody would ever even see it. So like it's white on white and it's inside your clothes, and they put just an immense amount of creative work into it.
Here's the Ruggles
Oh, thank you, Dan.
Templar.
And yes, so and that was done on a linen homespun with silk embroidery. It's of course very faded because it is 250 years old, but it's really quite a thing to have a piece like that. So Michelle confirmed that the patterns were very rare and urged us to have them conserved, and that work is being done by Works on Paper in Bellows Falls. Next year, the part of our sampler collection will be on display during a statewide Vermont sampler tour that Michelle is part of organizing. So we had a table at the community festival to celebrate the Institute's 100th birthday. That was a success for us, and I think for the Institute, and it was a lot of fun. And the festival embodied the spirit of community that the Institute has always been all about. And really, kudos to the organizers, especially including Susan Harlow, who's here with us tonight. The SAR, as Dan mentioned, returned. They were here last year, and they came back to place markers on more graves of American patriots buried in the old cemetery on Courthouse Hill and the Gilson Cemetery on Sauve Road. They may come back next year to do one or two in Westminster West. There are a couple of unmarked ones. But it's a big undertaking, and since he's all the way from, I think, Montana, it's possible that they may let us do it. But one of the head of the Vermont chapter of the SAR said something to me that I need to track down, but I think that that there are 47 Revolutionary War veterans in the old cemetery, and that's the most in any cemetery in Vermont. So I could be wrong about that. We have the most of something that the SAR is impressed about, but I think that that's what he told me.
I thought it was 43, but it's somewhere in the 40s. Yeah.
Right, and then I may be putting together the people that are in the Gilson Cemetery. And of course, there's several in Westminster West and the other. And
the SAR is the Sons of the American Revolution.
Thank you. Yes.
There was a question about that.
Thank you.
They actually came before the Daughters of the American Revolution. The Daughters wanted their own organization, so that it's a very old organization.
Got it. Thank you.
So I have the program here, and there are 43 names in the East Parish Cemetery and 3 in the Gilson.
Okay.
I'm going to turn your video off. Okay. And your microphone.
Welcome, Nancy. And so beyond that, Westminster has a prominent place in the new film biography of Fanny Allen that was created for the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum over the last couple of years. And Fanny and her mother were both here during the Westminster Massacre. She met and married Ethan Allen here, and she later lived here with Ethan Allen's and her children, and then married her third husband, Dr. Penniman, and lived here with him for a while. So the film is only shown in the museum in Burlington, but if you get up there, check it out. A good bit of it was filmed in our museum in the town hall, and I don't know if he filmed some inside the Penniman house up on Orchard Hill, but he and I got to go inside it, so that was cool. So, and we do continue to think about a home of our own. We're doing some investigating, so that's likely something you'll hear about in the future. And so next year, stay tuned for the 250th anniversary of the Westminster Massacre. We are planning now, probably going to do a candlelight vigil at the William French Monument, and then a gathering with speakers, and hope to have the state declare Westminster Massacre Day. So we hope we have someone here who may be able to help us with that, Michelle. And if we have the volunteers to pull it off, we may do another reenactment with the school kids as was done in years past. And I know that was something that really meant a lot to kids. Takes a lot of volunteer work to bring it off, but if anybody would like to help with that, contact us through our website or our Facebook page. So that's all I have to say on that. We do have 2 board members. We have 2 slots to fill on our board, I should say. The ones currently occupied by Obi Lisai and Dan Axtell, who have both told me they are willing to continue to fill those roles for 3-year terms. We can also accept nominations from the floor. And so I await your pleasure. What we ordinarily do if we don't have a nomination from the floor of someone else is someone would nominate the 2, and then I would instruct the secretary to cast 1 ballot. So what would you like to do?
I would nominate the 2, Dan Axtell and Obi Lisai.
Okay, we have a nomination. Do we have a second?
I can second.
Okay, Michelle has seconded and Pat has seconded, so it's wicked seconded. And, and do we have any further nominations? Then all those in favor of the secretary casting 1 ballot for Dan Axtell and Obi Lisai, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you very much. And that is, as far as I am aware, the business that is before us. Does anybody have other business that they'd like to bring before this annual meeting? And hearing none, I would accept the motion to adjourn and we would move on to our speakers.
I'll make that motion to adjourn.
Okay, and Pat seconds. I think Pat had moved before, but so all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Well, now if I can find my piece of paper here. This is always. We have with us tonight Chris Harlow and Susan Harlow. And my understanding of Harlow genealogy is that you guys are cousins. And you can say more about how you connect. Both of them grew up in Westminster, a couple years older than I am. So in the 60s and the 70s. Actually, both have served on the Westminster Select Board. Chris is on, I think, still on the Fire Department Prudential Committee. And Susan served, are you on the Institute board? Susan, on the board of the Institute, which just pulled off a really successful 100th anniversary celebration. So they have been citizens of this town. They've been citizens of this town for 200 years, actually. More than 200 years. The Harlow family came here around 1760. So cool that the 2 of you grew up in the same town 200 years later. And that was one of the first thing that I wanted to ask both of you about is if you had an awareness as kids of living in a town that your family had lived in for 200 years. Was that something that was part of your awareness?
Susan?
Go ahead, yeah, whoever.
Well, Chris and I were talking about our genealogy. I think he has more of a sense because his mother gave him genealogical information about her side of the family. I only knew about my father's, and I knew that went back quite a ways, but I was older before I really realized how far back it went. So, but my mother, I still know very little about her family. So Chris knows a lot more about that.
Yeah, the earliest Harlow that I know of was Eleazar Harlow in 1758, came to Westminster West, and I believe he lived in the house. I think it's, we call it the Anderson House, but I believe it's where Mary Mitchell, her family grew up, sort of near Nancy Colicchio and Mary Mitchell and where she lives now. Yeah, so the Harlow side certainly. And then my mother's side also, I have genealogies for, which goes back quite a ways. I have my great-great-grandfather was in the Civil War, Thomas Ashwell, and my great-great-great-grandfather was a Revolutionary War soldier, Levi Peck, and he's buried in the cemetery, the old cemetery in Westminster.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as the individuals between now and then, I would have to rely on looking it up, but that's my overall knowledge. We kind of came from Taunton, Massachusetts.
Right, which is the oldest roots of English settlement here in Westminster. It was the early grant from Massachusetts to citizens of Taunton. So
our
back
grandfather,
to the English go, yeah. So the story that I found fascinating about the Harlows here in the Revolutionary period is the story about Rhoda Harlow going out to the cornfield a week or two after the Battle of Bennington, going out to get some corn for supper and finding a wounded British officer out there in the cornfield, which must have been startling. And apparently he was a prisoner being marched somewhere, and he escaped, but was wounded. And the Harlows hid him and nursed him back to health and helped him get away to Canada. And then in gratitude, I've often wondered how he got to Canada, because in gratitude, he gave Rhoda his silver shoe buckles. So his shoes would have been flapping. But there must have been quite a bit of silver in those shoe buckles, because what was it? I think Zacchaeus Cole, that married into the family, who was a silversmith, made silver spoons out of them. At least one of which are in the Vermont Historical Society collection. So, it's such a neat story. So create such a vivid picture to think about walking out into your cornfield, and there's a red coat that's laying right there in your cornfield.
he lived in the West, right? Westminster West, they must have, because
Right.
I think there weren't any Harlows down in this side until our grandfather came
Right.
in 1917.
Okay.
Came to the lower village, I guess you would call it, because he had relatives. Of course, he knew relatives, and he had come to Westminster West for summers and to visit his relatives. And when he got out of Stockbridge School of Agriculture, he decided he wanted to farm up here, and he bought this farm where my brothers and I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
That was Paul.
So you grew up in what's now the Harlow farm in, is there a name for that part of Westminster? And I mean, I know I've always called Westminster Flats, you look down Courthouse Hill and that's the Flats, but are you also the Flats all the way up there, or no?
We would be the station. I think we would still be the station, probably because that's our post office too. So, yeah, no, we're the station, I would say. Yeah, the station.
And Chris, so where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up, I was born, my parents lived at the bottom of Sand Hill. And I was born at the Rockingham Hospital, actually, Dr. Hebb. And then we moved from there to where Pete Harrison lives now, on the southern end of the village of Westminster. I lived there until 1962, and when my dad had built a house across the road, where Joan Harlow lives now. And that's where I grew up, at the southern end of the village of Westminster.
Mhm.
Yep.
And
Until I went off to school. Yep.
and so, Susan, that your father was a dairy farmer at that time, right? And Chris, what did your parents do?
My dad worked in when he came back from World War II. He didn't go back to the farm, but he took a job at North at the Culvert Company down where the Abenaki building is.
Mhm.
Wortco is. He worked there for 65 years as a truck driver. He and Dennis Lawrence and Floyd Lawrence.
Mhm.
And my mom worked for the Experiment in International Living, which the campus is where Greenwood School is now. And then later on, she worked at SIT down in Brattleboro.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So what I loved, I'm gonna kind of like pretend to be a grown up for a minute here, but what I loved about Chris's list of topics was such a great kid list. It was like other kids, bicycles, school, games, sports, fishing, and then it was hunting and camping and like, so we're gonna kind of get the boring stuff out of the way and a little bit, and then we'll talk about the fun stuff. So you went to the center. Did you both must have gone to the center school? Is that right?
Correct.
And it was only it was a much smaller school then. There was only the one.
There were 4 classrooms then, right? But, well, maybe by the time you got there was more, but
There was more. There were the 4 new ones, I think, after you. And it went into, when I was there, it went till the 8th grade. But I was the last class that ended at the 7th. I ended at the 7th grade because they opened the middle school, which was for 7th and 8th graders. But my 7th grade year was at the Westminster Center School.
Mhm.
And yours was different. Yeah.
Right. And I'm a couple years younger. So I remember when there were those enormous big kids over there in that other wing that was like really kind of scary and like, wow, they're huge. And then they disappeared. So we bridged those eras. Were there any particular teachers that you remember from that era?
Doris Loomis,
Mhm.
Mrs. Chamberlain,
Mrs. Bullock,
Mrs.
Mm.
Bullock,
John
See-
Porter,
Oh, John Porter, you.
Dick Miller, Mr. Miller.
Mhm.
Mrs. Patch was my 1st grade teacher. Mrs. Loomis was my 4th.
Right.
Mrs. Loomis was 3rd and 4th for me, and Mrs. Chamberlain was 5th and 6th.
Yeah, Mrs. Bullock was 6th. Mrs. Chamberlain was 5th. Yeah.
And was Mrs. Metcalf there when you were there?
I don't remember. I don't think so.
I remember very fondly as just being such a kind, warm person, and the first teacher that got through to me. So after kindergarten and 2 years, so it was like 4 years in, like, oh, you mean there were nice teachers? How cool is that?
She was my neighbor, and she was very sweet.
She was
very nice people.
She was wonderful. So, Chris, you probably walked to school, right? I mean,
I did.
Yeah, and Susan did.
Or road bikes. Yep.
Did you take the bus? You would have.
Everyone down my way took the bus. No one's parents drove them to school.
No, that was not a thing in my.
But I got on the bus the first time my mother sent me to kindergarten, and it was in Bellows Falls then. So I remember getting on the bus. It was the high school bus, and of course it was full by the time it got here. I remember walking up the steps and looking down at all the high schoolers. Terrified. Someone had on me. I'm not sure who it was, but yeah, I did. Then we always rode the bus, and I was a patrol. If anybody remembers being a patrol, you had a canvas belt that you had to wrap in one particular way, and when you stopped, you got off the bus, stood in the middle of the road with your arms out so the kids could walk back. It was a very important role in your life if you were a patrol.
Yes, I remember that we looked up to the patrols and we thought the belt was incredibly cool. And
It was very cool. Yeah.
the way that you had to roll that, what was that all about? I don't
Yeah, I
even
don't know, but
know, but I remember that
Mhm.
whole thing about them rolling that and people who
Mhm.
were the patrols.
we
So
required that. And our bus driver was Guy Jennison, if anybody remembers Guy. Who, well, there were many stories about Guy, and I don't know if this is true, but it was often said that you had to be careful when he opened the bus door, that when he spit the tobacco on it, it didn't you. But but I remember that he would always get in a big tear when cars would pass the bus, and he would holler, and we would all jump up to try to get the license plate. Yeah, because he would report them.
excellent.
That was Guy. Yeah, he was a disciplinarian on the bus.
Yeah, he lived right next to the school in the big gray house.
Yeah, I know. I think of that as the Jennison House. That's probably decades ago now, but yes, and our bus driver out here in Westminster West back in those days was McIntyre. What was his first?
God, yeah, Mac.
His name was McIntyre.
Yeah,
He was a farmer, and he used to
we bought milk. from
he
him.
used to carry milk on the bus so that kids would pick up the family milk at the end of the day and take the milk home. So that it was the milk run as well as the bus. Very ecologically sound. So were you guys part of the church at that time? Chris, I know you mentioned bell ringing. And I have the impression from Barb's talk last year that most people in town went to the church, but was that so when you guys were growing up?
We went to the Episcopal Church
Mhm.
in Bellows Falls. That was our church.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, my mother took us there.
And I went to the Congregational Church in Westminster, and yeah, it was pretty well attended. We would go, and the younger kids would go, and there was always two people, usually boys, that were chosen to be to sit in the deacons' chairs by the back door. So as the congregation took their seats, they had their responsibility was to close the doors, and then to ring the bell to call people to worship. And then halfway through, after before the sermon, all the kids could go downstairs where we would have a Sunday school downstairs. And Mrs. McKinney was our Sunday school teacher. So we'd be in the kitchen downstairs.
So we have a question from Alice. Did the Kern Hatton kids walk down?
Yes, they did.
Those days? Yeah.
Yes, they did. Yep. Mr. Fisher would walk with them, and they would walk down. And it was an interesting dynamic in that we didn't really know them. There were a lot of city kids, and so they were ethnic. And we were a bunch of little white Vermont kids and so the exposure was great. It's just, it was, I wish it had been, I wish that it had been a better learning and moment for everybody because we really did stay separate, probably because it was church and you got into church and you were quiet and that sort of thing. But yes, they did walk down every Sunday.
Thank you. Yeah. And was there a choir?
Absolutely. And there was a large choir. And they would have solo singers that would come in. I can remember this one fella came in and sang, and he was one of the Lawrences, and I can't remember his first name now, but I was pretty young back then.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, the choir was both sides of the pulpit up there. Has choir balconies, and they were pretty full.
Hmm.
It was David Lawrence.
A lot of kids and older. And you other folks who were there, feel free to
Yeah.
right in, tell about it.
And so since we just went through a lovely celebration of the Institute, was the Institute a big part of what was going on in Westminster in the 60s? It was still in its heyday.
Oh yeah, there were a lot of things that happened at the Institute. I remember the firemen always had a roast beef supper up in the big room, all the tables jammed together. Because I remember my father, probably your father, I'm sure, Chris, serving the meals from the kitchen downstairs.
The Boy Scouts served.
Oh, the Boy Scouts served.
But the
Sorry.
fire department did the cooking. George Cody and
Right.
Sumner and Ralph and Hollis and
Yeah.
and they did the cleaning of the dishes. Yes.
Right. I remember that. Right. And there would be a Christmas party every year, and do you know who was Santa Claus, Chris? Santa Claus would sit up on the stage, and every kid would trudge up there and get their little bag of goodies that had candy. And I remember that there was an orange in the bottom. So that must have been back when fresh oranges were fairly rare, maybe. I don't know, but we always got an orange and something else in it. That was a big deal. And then there would be a Halloween party every year.
You'd have a parade, Halloween parade.
Yeah, when you carry a pumpkin around probably. I can't remember.
Yep. I won a 50-cent piece once. I remember that.
You did?
I did for my jack-o'-lantern that my dad helped me make. So.
Well, you have your father's luck then, I'll tell you. I didn't.
Yeah.
So.
And the Boy Scouts were held at the Institute. We learned how to, the local kids up in the village, we utilized the Institute all the time. We played basketball. We would go over to Cliff Morris's and get the key and go over and play basketball. We had what they called Youth Center, which was on Friday and Saturday nights. That was when we were a little older, 7th grade, 8th grade. And we had ping pong tables, we had pool tables, we had basketball, we had jukeboxes, we had a little store. So there was 35, 40 kids every Friday and Saturday night that would go there. This policeman from Bellows Falls, Ziggy Ostrowski, ran it for a couple of years. It was really a big deal, and I thought it was a really great service to the kids, give us something to do.
Now, Susan, you were all the way down in Westminster Station. Did you get up to that as well, or were you?
No, I didn't. I didn't go to the Friday and Saturday night. I think Mrs. Cody had the Arbutus 4-H club in the downstairs library room where I learned to sew. That's what I used. The other thing, I've told the story a million times, but there used to be showers downstairs and locker rooms, and so. Like most people, we didn't have a shower. We only had a bathtub. And so every once in a while, especially in the summer, our parents would load us into the car. And we had a big asparagus bed then. And we would take leftover asparagus down to Jonesy's place in the village. We dropped that off. We would go to the Institute. And my mom and I would go to one side, and my father and brothers, we'd take a shower. We thought that was like the most exciting thing ever. And then we would go down to Izzy Parda's for an ice cream, and then we would drive around and look for deer. That was a very exciting night.
A big night for
our family.
Round the horn, we used to call it.
Yeah.
So what is the loop around the horn?
You used to go up from the School Street, and then we'd go up past Kern Hatton, and then go over Morris Brook Road, and come back down from Morris Brook back down to the farm.
Right.
And all the deer would be at the farm.
I'm sorry, where would the deer be?
The deer would all be at the farm at Harlow Farm. There'd be 8 or 10 buck out in the field, and we're all up looking for. And I have a great story about Paul Harlow. I'm gonna out Paul Harlow when he was a young lad, and he was in the barn one day, and George Cody came in and said, looking for Hawker Hollis Harlow, Susan's dad, said to Paul, "Where are all the deer?" And Paul said, "They're hanging in the silo." And it wasn't deer season.
I didn't hear that story.
Oh, well, you should ask your brother.
I'm going to.
Yep, true story.
Yeah.
I always wondered what Hawker, how he got that name. What did that mean?
You want me to tell that story, Chris?
Yes, Susan, go right ahead.
Yep. So back in the 30s and 40s, there was a radio show that had a cowboy and Indian in it. And so Chris's dad and my dad were very close. And Ralph got to be the cowboy, and my father was the Indian, and the Indian was called Hawker on the radio show.
Oh,
His real name was Hollis, but he kept that nickname his whole life.
wow. Gosh, I remember working at Allen Brothers and people using that name about him, and
Oh yeah,
I never understood. Well, what is that? So now I'm really
he always told us anyway, so I'm sure it was true.
sounds entirely plausible. Sounds really like, yeah, huh. So you at 4-H, you were at the Arbutus 4-H. So and were there Girl Scouts also? I know at one time there were Girl Scouts, but maybe not.
I was not a Girl Scout. I was only a 4-H'er. Yeah.
So moving more to the free range kid kind of thing, because I love Chris's list of starting like other kids and bicycles, and we're all, the three of us are baby boomers, and it's a very different world than what it is today. But that the villages were just full of kids. There were so many kids in those days. So and I'm sure that was Chris's experience in the village. And Susan, were there kids around in your area in the station, or were you kind of a more, even though you're on the main drag, more isolated, or
yeah, there weren't many kids in our area, so
and it wasn't the kind of thing, I mean, it was a different era. It wasn't like your parents would take you up to Westminster to go hang out with that gang, or
well, they would, I had friends every once in a while, Susie Bays and Karen Waters. My mom would drive me down and leave me off, and someone would drive me back. But I wasn't there as much as Chris was. I think one of the places we all were often was at the Westminster Pool up on Morsebrook Road, which was a great thing back then. And the men in town took care of it. It had sand on the beach, and everybody, most mothers didn't work back then. So in the summer, they bring their broods up and they spend the whole day, sitting on the bank, smoking cigarettes, watching their kids and dragging them out of the pool. We swam there all day, and then we went home, and when my dad got done milking, we load up the picnic basket and come back and grill hot dogs and spend the evening there. So yeah, it was a very based place back then.
So that was where people from different parts of town got to hang out together.
I think so. I mean, I remember, it's mostly my mother's friends that I remember, the Hammonds and the Harlows, and yeah, it was very crowded. Kids all got together. It was a great place, I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that big a place, so when I think about that many people coming, it must have been pretty crowded. Yeah.
A lot of people
We all fed each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I love you're mentioning the moms, and Chris, you have moms on your list of things to talk about. And before we launch into maybe all the kid wildness, say something about the moms and why you wanted to talk about that.
Well, there was a lot of kids, like you said, and it didn't matter what time of year, whether it was winter or summer or fall or spring or school time or whatever, a lot of us just hung out together. So inevitably the moms got to know everybody, and everybody became your mom, whether it was Mrs. Weiser or Mrs. Schwab or Mrs. Dawkins or Mrs. Smittitz. It just didn't matter. They all knew you. They would all call you out if you deserved it. But you could do things. I can remember falling and hitting my head and cutting my head at the Institute and running to Mrs. Basin's house. And, she would wipe my face down and drive me up to the hospital to get stitches. So everybody was your mom. And it was a real community feeling. I mean, you just felt safe that you could always rely on them, even though you were always trying to hide from them, being kids, you're out there you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere and nobody ever knows where you are. And those moms probably knew exactly where we were the whole time. So it was great. Good time.
Yes. And when you're in trouble, you just go to the nearest mom.
That's right. And they were either going to call you out on it or hide you in the back until the trouble passed. All of those things happened. So
yeah. I love that. That's a lot of us had experience with we had a lot of auxiliary parents, I think.
Exactly.
Think
Takes a village.
Yeah, even when you're So say something about bicycles.
Well, when I up on in the village, not a lot of hills in the village, so everybody had a bike. And as soon as you were done with school and you had to do your obligatory homework or chores, kids were on their bikes, and it was nothing to see 20 or 30 kids on bicycles, and everybody had bikes. We went to school on our bikes, and there would be racks of bicycles at the center school. That's how we got around, and that's why one reason that, and I've said this to you, that the hill between Westminster and Westminster West, that hill is massive, because the only way to get over it at that time was on a bicycle, which was a single speed. There's no gears or anything back then. And it was 3.5 miles to get just to the top. And that was a long way. So there was a very big hill between Westminster West and Westminster. So we didn't get to know the kids on the other side of the hill, except for later on when you went to high school.
Right. Yeah, that was just going to be my question. And yeah, you just really didn't have, and social events didn't really, I mean, as I remember social events, there were Westminster West social events like the corn roast.
Exactly.
But they were Westminster West. I don't remember that. And I was at the center school, but I lived in Westminster West. And so it was a whole different social group that you saw there, and that you
were 15 or 16 and cars came into play, then it made it a smaller town.
Right.
But during the bicycle era, even going to the swimming hole, it was a lot of uphills for us to get up there, but we would do it. We go down on the flats, but that was our transportation. That's how we got placed to place, and everybody had bikes, and we all utilized them, and you'd see bicycles everywhere all the time.
So, and speaking of town geography, Gageville, did that even seem like Westminster to you guys? Or, I mean, it certainly as a society, we have a hard time, just because it's geographically and culturally essentially such a part of Bellows Falls that it's hard for us to sometimes get our do justice to the role of Gageville in Westminster, and I'm sure they feel the same way about us. But when I was in the center school, the Gageville kids had their own school, and then it was closed because of safety issues, and they came to our school, and so that was a whole, just before going to middle school, a whole new bunch of kids that came in, and the big cultural shock for us was like when they needed to answer the call of nature, they'd raise their hand and say, "Can I go to the basement?" Which must have been where it was in Gageville. But I always thought, well, is that another word for the bathroom? And I think many of us started to thought maybe it was a more refined word for going to the bathroom. So we would say that instead. definitely, it was like a whole other world. And no,
There was Twin Falls, and there was the Little Egypt and the Big Egypt, which was all, they were all swimming holes, which were prominent, but that they're sort of on outliers as far as the little village.
I think our dads used to go out there a lot, Chris. I think our Uncle Roger used to swim at Twin Falls, etc. And that would be before the Westminster Pool was built, probably. Yeah.
Right. They would dive off the dam up there. There was a big dam in Catesville.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
And now, I mean, I remember Barb talking about a swimming hole down kind of the south end of the village. That must have been a bygone by the time you guys were running around. But
there's a cool one there. It's Old Route 5 used to shoot off before the interstate went through, and there's still a bridge there, and there was a swimming hole in front of it.
So you experienced 91 going through, and what kind of changes were you aware of as kids that made?
Well, we used to drive cows. We used to drive heifers up to for the summer up to John Williams pasture, which was off Morse Brook Road. But when the interstate came through and they took a piece of our land, then we couldn't do it anymore. And plus, and Paul remembers driving the heifers up there up the interstate before it opened, when it was still, before it was paved, the last time we drove the cows up there for the summer. So that's the main thing I remember about the interstate till later.
I think we have someone with us who was maybe the first person to drive on that interstate before she was maybe supposed to, but I won't say anything if she doesn't want me to. So say a little about fishing and hunting, Chris. I know that hunting is something that is still important to you, but yeah, say a little more about that.
Well, not everybody, but it seemed to me that everybody hunted back in the day. Everybody had guns. I can remember hunting my way to the high school and having a rifle and walking into the high school with a rifle in my hand, and Mrs. Buckley was in the office, and I would say, "Good morning, Mrs. Buckley," and she'd say, "Good morning," and I'd say, "Bring up my rifle," and she'd say, "Well, put it in the corner." And I'd go over to the corner and I'd lean it in the corner, and there'd be 4 or 5 other rifles there already. And the only rule they had was they didn't want us to load the rifles until after we left the ball field area. So we had to be past the ball field. That was their only rule. So certainly a different time.
Yeah.
But this is the new high school then, right?
This is the new high school.
High school, right? Okay.
Yeah. This is because in 72 was the new high school.
Right.
So you're a little older than I am. But yeah, so I mean, we all learned to hunt. Everybody's parents, Mr. Weiser, who was the principal of the high school, I'd go hunting with him, and Harry and Kevin, and so everybody hunted on. You go out on during hunting season, and every half mile on any road you went to, there was pickup trucks parked there, and people were off hunting. You don't see that anymore. This definitely has changed. There's still a lot of hunters out there, but it's not like it used to be. Yeah.
And you're talking deer hunting mostly. Was there, I mean, also partridge hunting, and there weren't turkeys in those days.
There weren't turkeys or coyotes, and yeah, it was mainly partridge, squirrels. The younger guys, Jim Smittitz and Tom Smittitz and Andy Bernier, and we would hunt squirrels, and we would actually eat them, that's what we did. And so yeah, it was squirrels, partridge, and then deer. We didn't have the moose. We didn't have turkeys until a little later.
And bears. I mean, I feel like there's many more bear than were around when I was a kid.
Yes, there are way more bear now than there were back then. Yeah.
And Susan, are you aware of, I know they must be pretty aware of like deer pressure on the farm. I mean, if you had $10 out in your fields back in the 60s, are deer an issue on the farm these days with the crops?
Depends on the year. This year we saw very few deer.
Mhm.
I don't know why. I think last year we saw more. I think it has something to do with the deer population and also where things are planted.
Hmm.
I do remember that there seemed to be more when I was a kid. It was more of a problem.
Hmm. Hmm. I wonder if that's changed because of, as Chris said, we didn't have coyotes then, so that must create some pressure on them. Although the foresters are always saying that we have more deer than we should for healthy growth in the woods. So
one thing we have a lot more of now is Canada geese, and they're a big problem. Yeah,
for the farm.
Oh yeah, yeah. We didn't. I don't remember those when I was a kid. We certainly didn't have that many.
No.
And so are they just uprooting crops and
Yeah, they come up out of the swamp and they just pull lettuce, etc., out of the ground. So
yeah, and scoop a lot. I would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's an outdoor life that Chris you're talking about, and maybe, and I don't know, Susan, was that your experience? You're more by yourself as a kid down there with Mr.
And we couldn't always go somewhere else to play, and in those days, the parents didn't really care if we were outside. In fact, my mother would say, get out and don't come back till supper time. As long as you're here by 6 o'clock, she was very happy with that.
Uh-huh.
So,
yeah, it was my husband's cousins, and this is down in Massachusetts. They shoo them out the door in the morning and lock the door. And if you were thirsty, there was the hose was there. Like, don't come back to supper. So
we had a lot of stuff. We had the barn and had, the barn had hay bales in it. So there were forts, and then there was the woods and all kinds of, my brothers were up there starting fires and, I don't know, building forts and shooting things with arrows. I don't know what they were doing, all kinds of stuff. I wouldn't even want to think, but yeah.
I know, especially the starting fires part.
Yeah, my brother Tom, he was quite the pyromaniac, and the river. They spent a lot of time down by the river too, and even though we were not supposed to swim in it because back then the river was quite dirty. In fact, if you swam in it, you would immediately get polio, according to my mother, and so we were terrified of swimming in the river.
Well, there's a lot of good reasons to terrify your kids about the river. The pollution must have been a great help. Certainly that can be a dangerous river. Yeah, so say something about forts, Chris. You have forts on your list.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll have to apologize to anybody in the village who's listening right now that your barns have been occupied over the years by kids. Yeah, we used to build forts all the time. I mean, that was part of what we did. We would go into whoever's barn, and we would try to find the most unused corners and haul your way through stacks of crates or whatever to find a little opening, and there would be a fort. And of course, young boys, everybody, nobody knew we were there, and we were out to save the world, and we were going to defend the town, and we had all of these little forts. So anybody that had a barn at one time or another had us in their barn.
Secret fort, yeah. Okay.
Secret forts. We would go to we would take corn cobs, and we would take the little green bamboo tubes from people's gardens because they were hollow, and we would make pipes, and we would fill them with corn silk that was dried, and so we were all. There was a little phase of us smoking these corncob pipes. So thank God we never burnt anything down that we're aware of. But the potential was there. But boys being boys and girls being girls, because it wasn't all just boys. Ginger Dawkins has some explaining to do, I'm sure. Ginger Cook now. Sorry, Ginger. But yeah, we had We had forts down by the river. We would build forts down there. There was plenty of material from old dumps and from old ties from the railroad, and we'd go out onto Goat Island and build out in the middle of Connecticut, and we would build forts out there. And,
Wow.
and we had quite a crew, so there was a lot of bodies to build things, and so it was just what you kind of did,
Are any
occupy.
of them still there? Like, do you go by any place and go and see the remnants of any of your forts?
Well, down at Carlton Greenwoods, which is actually owned by Paul Harlow now, there was a spot down there where we had a little fort, and I've gone by it in the last few years, and I see remnants of how we got into it, and the materials have been moved around, but a lot of them were.
Was that the barn, or where was it?
It was in the tool shed, not the chicken coop, but the tool shed.
Oh, yeah.
Up in the top. So, Tony Kissel had some great barns. Whether they're still there or not, I don't know. And they're there in my childhood memories, so that's where they exist at this point.
Neat. Alice had a question about Evans Wood. So
Yep.
Just say a little something about that.
Well, Evans Woods is the woods between the interstate, Kernhattan, and the village. And yeah, we spent a lot of time in there. There are some old roads in there, and there was not the temple. What did they?
Pagoda thing there.
The pagoda. And so the remnants of the pagoda are still there, and there's some wells that are there. And there was an old windmill there that what we understood supplied water to a fountain that was in a little pond there. So Evans Woods was a very central part because it was close, easily accessible by bicycle, but there were no houses out there at that point. And so once you got there, it was kind of our woods. It was the Winnie the Pooh 100-acre type of thing. And we'd spend a lot of time just either riding the trails and the roads, or again, building little forts. Our fantasies were played out there, and it was just a great place to be.
I don't know if it was true in your day that what's all houses and parking lot and everything was I think a potato field out toward Evans Woods, but also it had a dirt track around it where Dr. Buck used to exercise his standard bred racehorses. And so that was directly out the windows of the first, second, third, fourth wing of the school when I was there. I certainly paid no attention to anything that was going on in class if he was exercising a horse. It was and then we would go out on the track afterward, and my best friends and I would be horses, and in May we would reenact the Kentucky Derby around that track. So that was a major source of entertainment and distraction for a certain bunch of us.
Yep, I remember that.
On your list, you have spring burns with the fire department, and I was intrigued by that as well.
Sure. Well, in the fire department would go around and burn people's fields, and as kids, we would put on they were called Indian pumps, and it was a tank that went on your back like a backpack, and then it had a rubber hose, and then it had a spigot on it that you could pump. You would pull it back and forth, and it would pump. So the kids got to use those, and we would go from field to field to field, and they would light them on fire, and they would burn all the old grass up, and then so the new grass would take over. And so we would hit the fence post to make sure that they didn't burn. Or then we would do them right in town, behind Freddie Nelson's, or we would just go field to different fields. We were slated to be burnt. And so it was the firemen they would bring their kids along, and the kids would man either a broom or a rake or Indian pump, and it was just an annual event that we did.
And were your fathers in the fire department, either of you, or? I mean, my mother was the first, one of the first female firefighters, so I know it was only fathers before then. So
Actually, our grandfather, Paul Harlow, and my grandfather, Edwin Nowers, were the first two firemen in the town of Westminster.
Wow.
I remember reading a list once, and they listed them as being in the first, not the first two, but in the first establishment of the fire department. Correct.
So what was it? What was the fire department like when you were younger people?
Well, it was a
Like
small
cribbage, that's all I remember.
cribbage, right? Cribbage. It was a small building. There was the Mills's house was there, and then the fire station. And I can remember as a kid, there was a plexiglass window in the door, and you could put your hand through to unlock the door and go inside. And then I remember once we did that, and we were kind of sneaking around the firehouse, and somebody pushed the key on the radio, and somehow Jim Holton knew what that was, and all of a sudden here's Jim Holton at the door, very angry at us kids for being in the firehouse. It was a small little building. They had the Studebaker, K42M1, K42M2. I used to remember the call signs. On Sunday mornings, we would go down as kids and get to answer the radio, sit there with our dads, and they would do all of the radio checks from Keene. And so, yeah, it was very active. I think it's more active now, but I think back in the day, it was very active. I thought they did a great job for what they had to work with.
Mm.
Yeah. Ruth, you probably know about all of that.
Yeah, I seem to remember some of it.
So you promised us a plane crash, Chris. So
I know of two.
all right.
There was one landed down but near Burt Cove. The plane came in where you cross over into Walpole, and there's, as you go down underneath the underpass, and then to your right, there's that long field. A plane tried to land there once, and the nose wheel sunk in, and it stood the plane straight up and down. And so you could look across the field and just see the tail sticking up in the air.
Wow. So how it stayed? So it stayed straight up and down.
Yep, it stuck there. Yep, and it stayed there for a couple of days.
Wow.
But the one I remember was a guy named Frosty Abel, who used to land his small plane behind, which was Jim and Barb Holton's house along Cox Road, across from Westminster Motel. Anyway, he landed there a lot. And then one evening, my dad and my mom and my sister and my brother and I were out in the yard playing ball at our house, which is right on the south end of the village next to Alice Caggiano's, across from Pete Harrison's. And these two planes were flying over, and one of them, it was just getting dark, and one of them would come in and do a landing, but it wouldn't land. It just came down and then took off again, and the other plane followed it. And it did this pattern 2 or 3 times. And my dad recognized that the first plane was trying to show the second plane how to land.
Oh.
And so my dad jumped in the car, and he drove down 90 miles an hour and went out what is now Cox Road and tried to get his lights onto the field. And my sister and my brother and I ran down the road. And by the time we got there, what had happened is Frosty Abel had swung out, and the second plane came in too low, and it hit the trees, the locust trees, right next to Jim Holton's house. And the plane went straight down into the clothesline and landed on the ground. And when we got there, the people were still alive, and my sister helped the man out, and the woman had punctured lungs, and she was okay. She ended up being okay. They both survived. But that was a plane crash that happened right in the village.
Wow, right in front of you. Wow.
Yeah, I was probably 8 or 9 years old when that happened. Yep, that was one of two plane crashes that I knew of.
Wow. That, yeah, that doesn't sound good.
Morton Motors. Remember Morton Motors airplane? George Morton crashed his plane there by the garage too.
I don't remember that. That's your era.
Yeah, I remember that tree, this one, Frosty Abel, stayed up in the top of that tree for quite a while before the fire department got him down.
That's right.
He
Yeah.
didn't know how in the world they were ever going to get that plane out of there.
Does anybody have questions for our speaker? Our speakers, either of them.
I don't necessarily have a question, but it certainly has been a trip down memory lane for me.
When you spoke last year, Barb, it was the exact same thing for me. When you were talking about the Institute and swinging on the pipes, and I'm thinking I swung on that same pipe, and you think you're the first one to ever do it, but you weren't. And
yeah, we did.
Yeah, it's funny how
somebody was, and we don't know who, as a historical society. We'll never know who was the first person to swing on those pipes, but
it wasn't me.
no, but but that's, yeah. Anybody else have a question? I'm just this has been a really nice. I had a sort of philosophical question, I guess. I just kind of thinking back, your descriptions of Westminster in those days, and it's kind of a two or three part question. So what would you say are the biggest changes from then to now? And is there anything you're glad that we left behind, and anything you wish we could get back?
That community feeling that Chris was talking about, it really, I wish that it would come back, but it probably never will. But just like he said, everybody took care of everybody. We couldn't do a thing before, our mother knew about it before we got home, because everybody took care of us.
So to speak.
I think a lot of it was because, a couple things. People became more mobile. So, I mean, when we used to shop, we would go to Shattuck's, or we would go to Bellows Falls, and that's where we got our school clothes, and that's where we did everything. And of course now, and we would go to Claremont maybe once a year to get our school clothes. But otherwise, it was very insular. But of course now everybody can go everywhere.
We made everything in 4-H, in our 4-H, our beautiful.
Yeah,
my mother always said too, if you think that a man is after you, or somebody's being mean to you or something, run into any house, they'll take care of you. Any house, just like Chris said.
Another thing that I think is true is that every kid in town went to the center school, and every kid in town went to the high school. And so the community would all, like Friday night basketball games, you would see not just people from Westminster, but people from Bellows Falls, because everybody was there because all their kids were playing. And now kids are a lot more dispersed, and there are a lot more private schools and charter schools. And that's what
I thank you very much for bringing back a lot of memories. It's fun. Fun.
Yeah, Chris, what do you think about, what's different, and good or bad?
I think a lot of things are the same in a lot of ways. I don't live in the village anymore. I live in Westminster West now. And, but, back in the day, back when I grew up in the village, everybody knew each other. And I can't really speak to that at this point, whether that community is still there. I mean, Shattuck's store was such a central heart of the community, whether you needed, groceries or meats, or you wanted to go in and find out where the fire was. Shorty and Alice had that office up there with that scanner, and you could go in there and you just knew what was going on. And so that's probably there to some degree. I don't think it's ever going to be the way it used to be. So, we've lost a little with transportation, like Susan said, people getting around easily, communications with the electronics. You're not as, kids aren't as out and playing kick the can or playing hide and go seek or whatever. There's too many other things to do. So, I guess the nostalgic view is, I would kind of wish that was more for the kids, that are there now. Even though I don't see many kids there, I drive through town, I don't see kids there now,
The
and
demographics have really changed. There aren't that many kids.
there aren't that many kids. So
The
yeah.
school is.
And I was going through, and I remember going through and trying to think, the kids, the Basins down on the flats, or the Noises, the Dawkins, the Wisers. You could just go down through town and just the Smiditzes, there's just so many kids back then, and I could hardly name 2 or 3 now. So
Right, and
The only bicycles you see now are members of the Putney Bicycle Club. Never see a kid riding a bike.
yeah.
Families were bigger back then too. So instead of 1 or 2 kids, it would be 5 or 6 or 4. So, one house.
Yeah.
There's
Right.
a lot of them. And I think kids have more things to do now too during the, I think parents are more worried their kids will be bored. So it's always something that they don't just kick them out of the house and say, get out of my hair. Go
Figure-
find something to do. Right.
I think that the kids' lives are organized now. They have soccer when they're preschool. Their lives are completely organized and transported out of the village to these different organizations. And I think that is part of there are no more pickup games. No one, goes to the ball field and rounds up a bunch of kids to play ball. It doesn't happen anymore. They have an organized organization that will teach them how to play.
I used to like it when the kids would all work at the local farms, whether it was Holton's or Allen Brothers or Harlow's, Freddie Nelson's. There were all of these farms, and everybody had a summer job. And now you go to the farms, and you don't find local people working at these farms anymore. And they're just, it's just the times. It's the way
How
it is.
many kids do you know, teenagers, that have summer jobs? They don't work in the summer anymore.
right.
Some do.
Right, but and I do think one of the things that is just a historic demographic shift is that we are an aging society with far fewer kids, and so raising kids was a focus of the village, and there were lots to raise, and it made it, the kids were a tribe, and that made the adults into a tribe. It just all had a focus around young people in a way that isn't possible in a way, since there are many fewer. And then you do notice when you go by the school at the end of the day, all the cars that are there was so that that represents, a child or 2 being taken off to their house. It's not like they're all pouring out and going off to a place where the kids are in charge and are off in people's barns smoking corn silk, but they're they're going to a lesson, or they're going to something else. They take that away. So you can kind of see how historically how the change has changed who we are a little bit. But then I have to say, we had a really nice event at the Institute in just a couple months ago that really had a good community feeling about it, that we haven't had one of those in a while, a gathering like that. And it was it felt good.
People look for that, I think, and sort of starve for it, I think.
I think so. Well, I think it's time to wrap up unless anybody has a burning question, and I am going to figure out how we share this with other people. But it's been a really fun evening. I really have enjoyed. I've learned a lot, and
I have too. I thought I heard all Chris's stories, but I haven't, obviously.
I've only just begun.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks so
Thank you,
much. Thanks
thank
to
you.
everybody for coming. Really
Thank you.
see everybody. And I'm going.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Yes,
very
thank you.
much.
Bye, Susan. Bye, Ruth. Bye, Barb.
Bye. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Everybody, nice
Thanks,
to-
everybody.
Before you leave, but,
Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome.
yeah.
Bert Hours. Sneaking in there, Bert.
Good job. Good job.